Hello everyone, it is now 12 o'clock, so I think we'll just get started. First of all, hello and welcome to our Creative Space Series recap webinar on the Brainstorming Workshop and the Best Practices Report. My name is Amy Poole and I'm the Program Manager for ArtsBuild Ontario. Just as a quick little just apology in advance, so I am working from home. You may occasionally hear a dog bark in the background. He is upstairs, but it shouldn't be very often, so just wanted to mention that. ArtsBuild Ontario has been working over the last 2 years on this project with 19 creative space partners. And we're looking forward to sharing this information on our workshop and report with you, and of course, answering any questions that you may have as well. So just before we get started, we'll just need to review a few housekeeping items. So first of all, you can hear us, but we can't hear you. Your microphones have been disabled for this webinar, but you can use your speakers or headphones to listen in. You can adjust the sound by clicking on the speaker icon at the top of the meeting. So as just a quick test, could everyone please type in a quick yes or no in the chat box if they can hear me clearly? Perfect. Great, thank you so much. This is great. So we will be recording this session as well, and it will be emailed to you along with the PowerPoint presentation following the webinar. So please keep an eye out in your inbox for that as well. Finally, we will also be emailing out a quick survey following the session. We ask that you please complete the survey so that we can continue to develop programs that respond to the current needs of creative spaces. And as well, we will have some time for questions during this webinar. So we'll have 2 Q&A periods for each section during the webinar to answer these questions, as well as additional time for discussion towards the end of the webinar. Please use the chat box located on the bottom right to type in your questions, and we will get to as many as possible. If you are new to our Creative Spaces series, or if you haven't heard of us before, ArtsBuild Ontario is a non-profit arts service organization which offers programs and learning opportunities related to the building, managing, and financing of sustainable creative spaces across Ontario. I do see that there is one person having audio issues, I would recommend reloading the reloading the webinar, and we will also have Alex Glass, who is responding to that. Thank you very much. ArtsBuild Ontario, we are also the only nonprofit organization in Ontario who is dedicated to developing long-term solutions to support creative spaces through training, tools, and resources. This webinar is a part of our learning series, which is one of ArtsBuild Ontario's core programs, alongside the Creative Spaces Mentoring Network, Space Finder in Canada, and Asset Planner for the Arts. The learning series offers learning opportunities, resources, and tools to support arts organizations in different ways. So today's webinar will be presented in 2 sections, as I mentioned before. In the first section, we will recap everything that happened at our in-person Creative Spaces Brainstorming workshop, which took place on Tuesday, February 25th, 2020. This workshop was provided for arts organizations who are considering or currently embarking on a creative space project, and it allowed them an opportunity to brainstorm ideas for their project, as well as hear from other arts organizations on their own projects. In the second section, we will then shift focus to the Creative Spaces Case Study Series Best Practices Report, and we will provide a summary on creative space capital projects collected from 19 arts organizations across Ontario. These creative spaces include spaces such as theaters and performance spaces, museums and art galleries, art centers, and more. Okay, great. I'm glad to see that we have audio issues resolved, so I will continue on. This webinar will run from 12 p.m. till 1:30 p.m., so we will have approximately an hour and a half together. Following each section, we will have about 10 minutes for any questions you may have, and then after the final Q&A and discussion period, We will conclude with a brief wrap-up on learning opportunities, programs, and resources from ArtsBuild Ontario that are available to you as well. So with that, let's get started with a recap of the Creative Spaces Brainstorming Workshop. On the slide shown, you'll see a brief overview of what we'll be discussing in this section. The workshop was facilitated by Lucy White of the Osborne Group and former member of ArtsBuild Ontario's Advisory Committee. Leading the webinar, Lucy asked 3 major questions that spurred discussion and insight from participants. It allowed them to identify needs and common challenges for their creative space projects, and then share their own experiences with others. In this section, we will also elaborate on information given at our panel during the workshop, highlighting 3 capital project examples that were shared by our panelists, Jamie Griffis, Director of Programming and Promotions at Idea Exchange, Kendra Fry, General Manager at Trinity St. Paul's Center for Faith, Justice, and the Arts, and Nadine Baker, Facility Manager of the Tett Center for Creativity and Learning. Furthermore, we will also provide a brief summary of the Studio X presentation by Conestoga College students Alexis Van Leeuwen, Emilio Navarro, and Jackie Cooper, who are in the Bachelor of Interior Design Honors Program. Our first question of the day for the workshop was, if your creative space challenge was a creature, what would you feed it? This allowed participants an opportunity to think about their creative space projects on an abstract and conceptual level. Allowing some time for individual brainstorming, participants soon grouped up to discuss their creatures and develop a more finalized idea of what they would feed them as a means to resolve challenges, as well as build successful spaces and sustain their creative spaces. We had a variety of creatures, ranging from cats to peacocks to dragons, which was quite fun and unique. They had similarities in personalities, yet were rather unique and represented notable challenges to consider for creative spaces. One example of note was that of the condor, who is quite beautiful and can spread its wings to really show its potential. The condor is also able to adapt to its surroundings, such as land and sky, to thrive, and so groups suggested to feed it healthy foods, like fruit and leaves, to keep it strong. Such an example can really emphasize the potential of a creative space to thrive. Common challenges that creatures represented were maintaining relevance in a community, the aging of the creature or facility, and a lack of growth or stability. To thrive, common things fed to the creatures as solutions include the freedom to change and adapt to surroundings, the ability to support a community's mindset rather than the creature itself or organization, social stimulation, and love and support. Questions on these different challenges also spurred other interesting points of discussion during the workshop, such as the concept that stasis could potentially compromise an organization's space, and the importance of remaining stable without delaying or not addressing organizational needs through a space is crucial for creative spaces to thrive. Participants discussed the possibility of how stability of a space or organization can act as a counter against stasis, ensuring that your creative space is firmly relevant in your community and meeting their needs. The panel, featuring Jamie Griffis, Kendra Fry, and Nadine Baker, then took place, with each of the panelists taking about 10 minutes to introduce their creative space projects, going over the successes and challenges they faced, and how operations continued after the execution of the project. Jamie Griffis, who is the Director of Programming and Promotion at Idea Exchange, was the first to present, providing details on the project to redevelop a former post office in Cambridge into a creative makerspace from 2012 to 2018. The City of Cambridge had purchased the building in 2012 with the intention to preserve the heritage site and transform it into Idea Exchange's newest location. Idea Exchange had identified a need to expand their programming space, as space at their other locations were not meeting the demand and their programming had doubled during this time. They engaged in a capital project to renovate the old post office while maintaining the heritage site and original interior design. Opening its doors in 2018, the building includes 3 different floors of makerspaces and includes a monogram coffee roasters as a cafe space. Amongst many lessons learned, one thing that they kept in mind was to be flexible. Jamie used the example that when they were building each floor, for example, they had originally designated each space based on the age of their patrons. So, for example, one floor had a children's discovery center with an interactive light bright wall, gears, and pulleys. However, teenagers and adults also wanted to visit this discovery center in addition to the kids. While this was not how they originally envisioned this space would be received, idea exchange was flexible and took note of how their community reacted. Our next presentation was from Kendra Fry, the General Manager of Trinity St. Paul's Center for Faith, Justice, and the Arts in Toronto. Kendra spoke on the capital project executed in partnership with Trinity St. Paul's United Church and Center and Taffel Music Baroque Orchestra and Chamber Choir, which took place from approximately 1991 to 2016. Trinity St. Paul's and Taffel Music have been space-sharing partners since 1981. The creative space project in question was to renovate Jean Lemon Hall. This project saw the church's sanctuary transformed into a professional venue for performance and a refined space for worship. Renovations officially took place between 2012 and 2014, and the project officially concluded in 2016. As food for thought, Kendra noted that the culture and identity of the transformed space is important to consider. The space is considered a church that is also a recital hall, as opposed to a recital hall that is also a church, as Trinity St. Paul's are the owners and operators of the building itself. Understanding what your space is or what you want your space to be in relation to your community and the community of your partners or tenants is important to consider when embarking on or undergoing a creative space capital project. Lessons learned after the first year of the project were largely based on this identity of the space and the organizations involved. For Trinity St. Paul's this meant not losing sight of its core values through the addition and creation of an improved performance hall in their venue. The space evolved from a traditional sanctuary to a professional performance venue, which had then increased expectations for an attractive aesthetic in the space as well. The last panel presentation we had was from Nadine Baker, the facility manager for the Tett Center for Creativity and Learning. Nadine spoke on the Creative Space project to develop the former John K. Tett Center in Kingston into a creative hub. John Tett originally had a vision for a creative arts hub, but operated more of a community hub rather than designated art space. To fully realize and improve upon John Tett's vision, this project saw the rejuvenation of the Tett Center from 2005 to 2015 by the hands of the nonprofit umbrella organization, the Tett Center for Creativity and Learning. The heritage building itself is owned by the City of Kingston. However, it is operated by this organization. The Tett Center for Creativity and Learning provides creative space for below market rent for multiple disciplines such as dance, visual arts, pottery, weaving, and more. The center arranged for artist tenants to occupy the space before opening, and the programming available at the space comes from both the tenants and the Tett Center organization as well. One lesson learned after the first year of opening was that setting aside a budget for investments in your space is important so that you can keep responding to the needs of renters. In addition, Nadine recommended that flexibility is key to ensure that the space does not become stagnant, as there are always new things to consider to make your space even better. Following presentations during this panel, we had a Q&A period for the panel, which allowed an opportunity for arts organizations to ask any questions that they had. Popular topics during this discussion included governance of creative spaces, how to tell if or when a space is thriving, and naturally, the benefits of being flexible with your creative vision. Let's break down these panel Q&A discussions based on their topics. Governance was the first topic touched on, with participants asking our panelists if they faced any challenges regarding governance of the space with organizational ownership and the involvement of tenants. With buildings such as the old post office and the TET Center being owned by the municipalities of Cambridge and Kingston, panelists, who represent organizations responsible for operations in these buildings, felt supported in a joint purpose to support and engage their communities. Panelists urged that arts organizations should really open up to the option of governance to gain the trust of their partners, tenants, if applicable, and communities, and to really listen to what everyone has to say in such a relationship as well. Panelists also noted that for a creative space to thrive, the process must be a bit messy in the sense that you, as a manager of your creative space, must constantly be in communication with your partners and community to remain relevant and change or adapt to various identified needs. Panelists made suggestions to listen to your community needs and focus on different methods to sustain your creative space. They also emphasized the importance of considering expanding your space to be multi-purpose rather than single-purpose. Allowing a space to be a multi-purpose hub, for example, creates the opportunity for it to grow and attract a wider audience. Counterpoints to this statement were brought up in discussion, elaborating on how single-use spaces are less costly and they can be a bit tidier. Ultimately, panelists believe that multi-purpose spaces offer a greater benefit to their communities. Discussion on this topic concluded that change can be difficult to adapt to. However, the unexpected should instead be welcomed to engage your communities in relation to your creative space. The importance of understanding the history and identity of your creative space in order to ensure that it thrives was also discussed by participants and panelists. Learning from its history allows you to see what worked, what did not, and of course what could be improved upon to allow it to thrive. In doing so, it can help you to develop a clear vision of your creative space's identity. At the same time, panelists urged that flexibility should be at the forefront of organizations' minds when it comes to their vision of the space. Too often is the case where organizations cling to their vision and are unwilling to change it, making it a quote-unquote precious thing, as mentioned in the panel Q&A. The takeaway from this segment of the panel is that arts organizations must listen to their communities and adapt their vision based on the needs identified by said communities. In turn, making individuals in your communities to be champions of your project would be ideal as well, as you've shown that you have listened to what they have had to say. The workshop then moved on to its second brainstorming question, which was, what are the forces that are helping and hindering your creative space projects? Commonalities and differences between these helpers and hindrances were a key point of discussion as a result. Common forces that help creative space projects identified by participants included community and partnership support, clear guidelines, business plans or revenue generation models, membership of the creative space and their support, and the ability to be flexible with your space. Planning, support, and allowing your vision to change as the community needs provides stability to your space, allowing it to thrive. Other helping forces mentioned by participants included the draw or attraction of the space, new developments or construction, tourism experiences and opportunities, networking, and politicians or champions at all levels supporting creative spaces. I would just like to take a brief moment to just make sure that everyone can still hear me. If the connection is still going through, if you could please type in a quick yes or no in the chat box. Great, awesome, thank you so much. Then I will continue. Common hindrances as well that were brought up during this workshop included too many voices being invested in the project, the costs or asset management of the space, and doubt in the project, which is inclusive of self-doubt and external doubt from others. Interestingly, there were fewer common hindrances in comparison to common helpers when we grouped answers. Other hindrances noted during the workshop included budgetary limitations, the state of the political environment, thinking small with your creative space capital project, your audience, the physical state of the building, for example, if it is dilapidated and needs work done to it, and cases where the space is not purpose-built and thus needs more work to be done to it. It's also important to remember that such forces can be helpers just as much as they are hindrances. Arts organizations identified that forces both helping and hindering their creative space included multiple stakeholders in a project, the density and interests of a community, the location of the space, how much room is available in the space, heritage protection, and state of mind of both the organizers and the community. The existence of multiple stakeholders in a project could be helpful based on their support. However, they could also be a hindrance if there is an overwhelming number of stakeholders building up pressure for the success of the project. The density of your audience is important to consider when developing your capital project, as your project may have a smaller or larger community based on location. As such, the location of your project is also incredibly important to consider, as it could be a great factor in determining your success. For example, is the location of your space accessible to the public? Is it close to public transit? Is it central in your community or outside of downtown? These are valuable questions to consider. Similarly, how much room you currently have or hope to have for programming can help or hinder your project. Planning for additional space or coming up with ways to innovatively use existing space are key factors in an organization's operations within their space post-capital project, and it directly informs the design and the use of the facility as well. Some buildings may also have a heritage designation, in which case it is necessary to enact heritage protection or preservation methods when undergoing your capital project. This act of heritage protection can draw the appeal of the community, but there can also be limitations to what you can do with the facility and in turn an organization's capital project. Finally, arts organizations emphasized that it is important to keep a positive state of mind when embarking on or undergoing such a project. Your state of mind can affect your team and community, so keeping that engagement for the project is an integral part of the process and the eventual success. Knowing the assets of your space and utilizing them in the most effective way that you can allows your creative space to thrive. However, understanding the limitations of a space is also important to consider, and it allows you an opportunity to brainstorm solutions. Coming up with solutions to combat such hindrances is a key part of the process to execute your project as well. As I mentioned earlier, the brainstorming workshop additionally included a presentation called Studio X, which was made by Conestoga College students Alexis Van Leeuwen, Emilio Navarro, and Jackie Cooper. This project was a mock plan to redevelop a former Schneider's factory in Kitchener into an art gallery and creative hub. The students first presented an overview of their mock plan of the space, and elaborated further on the more technical details of how they would design the space into an interactive artistic hub. The picture shown in this slide depicts the area of where the former Schneider's factory building is, on 321 Portland Avenue in Kitchener. The building in question is the square structure towards the bottom of the photo, and it is 20,000 square feet in size. The students wanted to develop the space in a way that both pays homage to the history of the building and invites new innovative ideas with its potential to exist as an art gallery. Their project sought to utilize technology in innovative ways to display and promote art, both local and historically famous, in order to attract a younger demographic. The plan implemented app and sensory technology throughout the building, as well as a virtual reality space. Following the Studio X presentation, we moved on to our final question of the day. We asked attendees to think on and discuss the question of what is the first step to achieving your preferred outcome? We posed this question to ask participants what their quote-unquote next step would be that would have a maximum impact. As a sub-question, we also asked them, what are your resources before, during, and after your project? In terms of resources, we made suggestions to consider public funds, earned revenue, and fundraising opportunities as well. Finally, we asked participants, how will you engage the community through their creative space project? Participants' answers revealed that many were at different stages in their projects. Some were just beginning to plan for their capital projects, others had capital campaigns underway, and some were even well into their project past the capital campaign. Many expressed interests in planning for different aspects of their project, including how to acquire funding, developing a plan to manage multiple projects, and formulating an accessibility plan for their facility. Having a more concrete idea of what funding you can apply for or how you can reach out to private donors solidifies your project. Planning for accessibility upgrades is also important to consider. It can be useful for arts organizations to reach out to their communities excuse me, about ideas for such improvements in accessibility, as it can steer them in a direction that they may have not considered previously. For arts organizations with a quiet campaign underway, sometimes the next step is to figure out how to launch your capital campaign to the wider community. Finally, participants emphasized the importance of peer-to-peer discussion when taking any first steps, particularly if one was unsure of where to start. For example, when developing a plan, it would be useful to reach out to fellow organizations of a similar discipline to listen to their feedback. They may have already undergone a project similar to yours, and they could offer some great advice based on their own experiences. There are a lot of things to consider for these first steps, but it is important to utilize all of the resources at your disposal when formulating a plan for your organization's creative space project. Towards the end of the workshop, we also took some time to discuss funding opportunities available to Ontario arts organizations. However, we will mention these funding opportunities at the end of the webinar today instead. So that concluded our Creative Spaces brainstorming workshop. Before we start our next section of the webinar today, I'd like to take about 10 minutes to ask if anyone has any questions about what was discussed at the workshop. If you have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat box located on the bottom right. If you would like to have a question to discuss or have answered, I'll just take a few moments to see if anyone has any questions, and then we will move on. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting workshop. We covered a lot of great topics, and the panel was very engaging, so it was a lot of fun to run it. And yeah, it was a great time. I see that we have one person typing, so I will just wait a few moments to see if they have a question to be answered. Okay. Well, we are at about 12:30. If anyone has any other, any questions they can think of, we also have that other question period coming up. Um, oh yes, it is also a creative process for sure. There's a lot to understand for these sorts of projects. Thank you very much for your comments. I appreciate that. So yeah, we'll have that second question period for sure. If you would rather, want to extend your questions to the end, and with that, we can continue on. And again, if you maybe think of any other questions past the webinar as well, you can feel free to email me. I will throw out my email at the end of the webinar as well. And yeah, so I would just wait one more moment in case anyone has other comments or questions, as I see some people are typing. No? Okay. Okay. So I think with that, we can move on then. We can keep going. So we are now going to move into the Creative Space Case Study Series summary of our Best Practices Report. The Creative Spaces Case Study Series features capital projects from arts facilities across Ontario. From the 19 organizations who we interviewed, capital projects ranged from major and minor renovations to new builds entirely. The Best Practices Report provides an overview of each case study with capital project needs, the process of how organizations executed their projects, how operations continued following these phases, and lessons learned. Our goal with this Best Practices Report and Creative Space Case Study Series is to provide arts organizations who are considering or currently embarking on a capital project with examples of similar and differing projects that were successfully executed, and the report can act as a guideline for arts organizations across Ontario in this sense. In this section of the webinar, we will briefly elaborate on each of these segments of the report to provide you with a more detailed overview of the document. The list shown here reveals the 19 organizations and arts leaders who we spoke with. As a brief note, you can now access 18 of these case studies on our website. The remaining case study will be published in the near future as well. You can access the complete Best Practices Report, which covers data from all 19 organizations, in both English and French at the link shown. And as a reminder, we will also email the link to our case studies webpage shown on this slide. We will email that out to you following the webinar as well, so you'll be able to access that at your leisure. The Best Practices Report excuse me, features 5 sections. These are who, why, what, how, and the ongoing. Who refers to the question of who was involved in the project and who led the project. It also refers to who does the project serve as a means to better identify the audience. Why asks why the project happened. What was the need identified by the community to push this project forward? The what is another important section, referring to the details of the project itself. So of course, what was the project, and interestingly, what was the length of the project as well. How refers specifically to the process. Now that we know who was involved and why the project came into being, how exactly was this project executed? Finally, the ongoing simply refers to how everything operated after the project. For example, what lessons were learned following the end of the capital project? So to provide a brief overview of the data from all 19 of these case studies, let's look at this data collected and summarized based on each of these categories. First, let's look at the who, being who was involved in the project and who was the project intended for. For a majority of these capital projects, who the space served tied back to the organization's mandates and purposes. Accessibility and community awareness were highly valued across all 19 case studies, and their capital projects reflected their goals to better serve their community. Who also refers to who is involved in the project, or who led the project, what positions were involved across all 19 case studies, and of course, what roles also comprised the building committees for these projects as well. In this report, we collected data on who led these capital projects based on their position, and we have summarized it in the graph shown. We can see from this graph that boards of directors have the highest percentage of those who were involved in leading the projects in these case studies, which would be at 53%. Executive directors led 42% of projects. 37% involved leadership from general managers and artistic directors, while municipalities led 32% of the projects. 16% involved a project manager, and 11% involved curators, tenants, city councilors, facilities managers, and volunteers. Finally, 5% of projects involved music directors, production managers, technical directors, consultants, and boards of trustees. In municipally owned buildings, the municipality and city representatives had a large role in the project as well, working with partner organizations to execute the capital project. For example, the City of St. Catharines partnered with Brock University to build the first Ontario Performing Arts Centre to develop a multi-purpose performing arts center. Similarly, other organizations engaged with municipalities as partners and consulted with them on a regular basis to discuss any project updates regarding cost, timeline, revisions, and more. In cases where facilities were not municipally owned, operations and facility managers had a major role. Building committees were comprised of staff and board members, partners, municipal staff, politicians, and key stakeholders invested in the space and organization. These committees were often established for these capital projects, and often only specifically for the duration of the project. However, some organizations had pre-existing facility committees as well. Similar to our first graph, we collected data across each case study to reveal who was on building committees or who was involved in the building process in general. As we can see from the graph, 53% of the case study reports named an architect on board their committees involved in the building process. 47% of these case studies also mentioned board members who were a part of these committees, followed closely by municipal staff at 37%. We can conclude that a majority of these organizations turned to members with more senior positions to be on these building committees. However, those involved in the building process who also sat on these committees varied by position. General managers sat on 32% of building committees, with executive directors at 21%. Campaign managers, city councilors, and facility managers sat on 16% of building committees, while technical planners and volunteers were involved in 11% of projects. Lastly, 5% of building committees included production managers, artistic directors, collections managers, curators, graphic designers, marketing directors, contractors, and finally consultants. Municipally owned spaces were required to undergo a competitive bidding process in order to hire contractors, but other organizations also issued requests for proposals, or RFPs. In addition to the building contractors, other specialists were hired to accommodate specific aspects of a project, such as heritage consultants in certain other cases. Why did organizations take on these capital projects? What were the vital needs? Furthermore, what were these capital projects specifically? On this slide, let's look at the why and the what together, because the reason that these projects were taken on led to the project details of what was planned and what was executed. The details of what each project planned to accomplish and executed varied, of course. However, commonalities between projects began to reveal themselves after collecting the data. This graph reveals the different needs that these organizations identified for their capital project. Accessibility was of the utmost significance to 73% of organizations through their capital projects. All organizations incorporated accessibility into their capital projects, starting in the planning and design stages. City-owned projects engaged accessibility advisory committees and municipal accessibility departments to review accessibility audits and designs. Some organizations, who were not municipally owned, also executed these accessibility audits as well. Other factors that were a focus for organizations included rental space and community awareness, which 58% of organizations identified. 53% of organizations additionally focused on programming space and growth for their projects. Similarly, 32% highlighted the importance of increased storage, while 26% focused on rehearsal space with their capital projects. Administrative space was also significant to approximately 21% of organizations, and 16% valued heritage preservation and restoration strategies for their projects. 11% identified a great need for operational changes, energy efficiency, and a reduction in costs. The majority of organizations completed LED lighting retrofits during major renovations to be more energy efficient. Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, or LEED certification, was also pursued by several organizations for their capital project. Lastly, 5% of organizations used their projects to primarily address issues related to health and safety. Types of capital projects included new builds and major renovations or retrofits, building either from the ground up or by retrofitting or renovating an existing facility. Other projects focused on upgrading accessibility. So this included things like new, wider seating and doors to better serve communities, as was the case with the Miles Nadal Jewish Community Center installing new accessible seating at the Al Green Theater. Energy-efficient upgrades were, of course, a focus, such as the installation of HVAC systems, LED lighting, as I mentioned, insulated doors, and more. Similarly, a priority of the Westdale Theater in Hamilton during renovations was ensuring that the venue was fully accessible. Ramps were installed in and outside of the building, and technological aid devices were made available to audience members, to name a few of their improvements. The project timelines themselves varied, largely based on the scale of the project. For example, smaller projects could only take a matter of months, whereas large-scale projects took upwards of 10 to 25 years. On average, the duration of these capital projects was approximately 6 years. The timeline of each capital project is dependent on a variety of factors, including leadership, operating models, financial resources, community and stakeholder buy-in, and contingencies, making each timeline captured in this project relative to the organization and their respective capital project as well. So let's also take some time to look at the how behind each of these capital projects. How did these projects progress? What challenges or successes did they experience? How were operations affected during this process? And of course, how were these projects funded? While the process was different from project to project, many organizations conducted studies and issue surveys to stakeholders to validate and shape the need for their projects. Excuse me. This included feasibility studies, spatial needs assessments, viability analysis, market analysis, and more. Some smaller organizations instead sought out confirmation internally through patron surveys, consultations, or observing needs through direct management of their facility. Additionally, there were 3 commonalities amongst projects that moved it from the conceptual phase to the building phase. These included having needs identified by the community through outreach and feedback, developing a business plan for organizational stability and growth, and having established funding that allowed the project to move forward. In cases of municipal projects, the design and building phases followed council approval to move the project forward. In each case study, the impact of a capital project affected the operations of each organization. In some cases, staff were overworked during certain phases of the project. For example, with idea exchange, specific tasks were outlined in chronological order to ensure that staff were not overwhelmed by maintaining day-to-day services while overseeing the quote-unquote in-the-moment logistics of the capital project during planning and construction. Once all action items in the project phase were accomplished, they would then move on to the next. This would then avoid burnout ultimately in the end. In addition to concerns relating to burnout, other organizations such as the Dundas Valley School of Art had to consider closing their facilities for a period of time. Programming had to be completed before the facility closed, and timelines were revised as a result. Other organizations, such as the Theatre Centre in Toronto, hosted pop-up programming to accommodate for their inability to run programs while the capital project was underway. In rare cases, other projects had little impact on the organization's general operations. In the case of the Canadian Automotive Museum, for example, the building was only closed for 1 week to account for the power and plumbing to be shut off. For a majority of the project, the museum remained open to the public. Depending on the organization's use of space, staff positions were expanded or added to reflect the current needs of the new space. These positions included general managers, facility coordinators, custodians, technical support, development staff, front of house, marketing staff, and curatorial staff. It was more often than not that staffing needed to increase or be adjusted to respond to the growing needs of the space. The most common challenge across these capital studies related to the project's cost. Some communities expressed concern over having projects financed with public funds, while there were other concerns about how the act of undertaking such projects would increase the deficit for some municipalities. Cost was most effectively met with organizations meeting with municipal staff, partners, stakeholders, and reaching out to the community with information to discuss the greater benefits in the long run for the project. Contingency plans were also put in place should any unforeseen roadblocks occur during the various phases of capital projects. Unexpected contingency costs came from situations such as fixing a wall that was too old to sustain the impact of construction, the removal of asbestos, cleaning up post-construction, and there was even surprise in how much it cost for certain organizations to secure specific permits. To manage this, organizations were flexible in their planning, often incorporating a buffer to account for any changes in timelines, for example. On average, organizations planned for a 15% contingency in their capital project budgets, though some organizations thought that increasing it to 20% would have been beneficial instead. In terms of capital project funding, from the collected data, we can see that the majority of projects secured public funding from federal, provincial, and municipal grants. These included the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund, the Ontario Trillium Foundation, the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, the Toronto Culture Build Investment Program, and various community foundations as well. Other sources of funding included private donations, capital campaigns, lines of credit, reserves of funds, remortgaging properties, and loans. We can see from this graph that 84% of organizations used federal funding as their main source for their capital project. This was followed by municipal funding and provincial funding, each at 68%. 37% of organizations underwent a capital campaign to finance their projects as well. Private donations were the primary funding sources for 26% of capital projects. 16% used alternative financing, and lastly, 11% used financial support from project partners as their main funding sources. While federal funding has the highest percentage here, all capital projects actually used many different financing options to match their foundational funding. Organizations such as the Lighthouse Festival Theatre, the Dundas Museum and Archives, Trinity St. Paul's and Taffel Music, the Westdale Theatre, and more held a capital campaign. While these campaigns covered only about 10 to 20% of the project costs and were not often a main funding source, it is still noteworthy that a majority of organizations pursued a capital campaign during their project. Organizations that did not use grants instead used a capital reserve fund, and/or they often self-funded the projects themselves. Lastly, we have the ongoing, which alludes to the operational phase after the project and what lessons were learned. There were a lot of challenges that organizations faced where their capital project affected general operations. However, it is the resolutions along with the lessons learned from these experiences that are important to note. The majority of organizations agreed that it was invaluable to have a contractor and architect involved in the construction process. When considering costs, several organizations, such as the Tet Center for Creativity and Learning, emphasized that it was useful to separate budgets during the planning process of their project. Other organizations, such as the Thunder Bay Art Gallery, for example, emphasize the importance of having positive relationships with team members and partners and keeping the dialogue open. Truthfully, it is an organizational effort. Having a dedicated team of staff, board, volunteers, partners, and more are vital to successfully execute your capital project. There is value as well in setting a schedule of tasks for employees and revising the list as needed to avoid staff burnout during various phases of capital projects. Other organizations also noted that they should have revised build plans a bit sooner, as a revised timeline set in place earlier would have been more helpful in the grand scheme of their projects as well. Ultimately, these lessons learned emphasize the importance of time management, organization, revisions, and relationships or partnerships. Having these organizations speak on the different challenges, solutions, and lessons learned can provide arts organizations and leaders looking to execute a creative space capital project with some great considerations at different stages of their projects. We hope that arts organizations will use this best practices summary, in addition to the case studies, to support their organizations and individual role in future creative space capital projects. Our webinar will be coming to a close in just a short while, but we'd like to take this opportunity to allow for some questions about the best practices report. I can see there's a comment that I will address very soon from Joni. So if you have any questions during this time, feel free to type your question into the chat box on the bottom right. If you have more of a comment as a point of discussion, we can also talk about that. And so I'll just take some time to take any questions and comments. So I'd love to see a graph that shows how many dollars come from the source of funding pie chart. For sure. Yes. So that would be interesting. Yeah. So we just have the one chart. I'll go back to the funding. And I'll go back to the funding chart very quickly. Funding. Whoop. I'm jumping ahead. Oh, here we go. So here we have the main funding sources for the projects. I did list the percentages, but in terms of seeing how many dollars came from each source, it does vary. You can get all of this information in the case studies that we published. So those would be on the link that you will also receive, because they kind of have sections where they're talking about how much it would cost for different phases of the project. Oh, for sure, yeah, cumulative data. Okay, we can, yeah, we can certainly consider something like that, look into it a little bit more. I don't have a slide that would represent that, but certainly I can look into that, or we can look into that, no problem. Yeah, so I will definitely follow up. It would be good to see, because it would give a better picture overall, or a nice picture overall, I should say, of of all of these, how all the different funds kind of contributed, for sure. Yeah, so I can definitely consider something like that, and I'll follow up with you, no problem. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. I see we have some people typing, so I'll just wait for a couple seconds and see if there's any additional things that I can answer. The report overall was very fun and very interesting to write. Collecting data from all these case studies, for sure. Yes, thank you for your question, Diana. So you're asking about how the committees were chosen and the process for choosing. Okay, yeah. So that information is going to be listed in the case studies that we published. Not all of them necessarily talk about the process, but they're typically, when they were, for a lot of the case studies, when they were choosing who to be on these committees, as I mentioned, a lot of them were in kind of senior positions. So they had the team or staff had approached these senior positions, or the senior positions were automatically, they were involved and would lead the project. But there were also different, like in terms of like hiring contractors and architects and things. There were, I did speak a little bit about the RFP process. I might just go back a bit to find it. So, yeah. So for this section, I'm just gonna go back a bit just to find my notes. Yes, so the building committees so for hiring architects, yes. So a lot of municipally owned spaces, a lot of them underwent a competitive bidding process, and other ones were issuing requests for proposals, or RFPs. Sorry, and in addition to the contractors, other specialists were also hired. So for example, if you have a heritage preservation, or a heritage building that you want to keep, preservation methods in mind, then they would reach out to them. But certainly the case studies go a little bit more into detail, because in a sense it was a bit unique to each project. So yeah, I would say that would be my answer. I see we have other. I hope that answered your question. I see that we have other questions as well.
Actually, Amy, I'm going to chime in here. It's Alex Glass from ArtsBuild Ontario. I'm the executive director.
Sure.
Diana, basically, I can see here that you've also asked how the committees were chosen and the process for choosing and hiring architects. So Amy answered your RFP process, but in terms of the actual committees and how those were composed, those were really relevant to each of the projects. So you would have some community members or city representatives that were part of that. But it really Sorry, the joys of working from home. Basically, we're looking at how, yeah, we're looking at the hiring committees, and so it basically depended on discipline as well. So if you have a theater, for example, you have a lot of techs on the committee. You have your executive director, you have your board leadership. It's really like who are the people that are championing the project on behalf of your organization. So for the majority, that is how those buildings.
Thank you very much. That clarification was great. Certainly gave more detail for sure. We also have a question I can see from Steve Piro. Yes, so when I was talking about the concern for public funding, was it a concern about the availability and necessity for public funding to go forward with the project, or was it a concern that public funding would compromise the vision of the project? That specific example that I was referring to, so that was in response to a deficit that the municipality, there we go, had. They didn't want to increase the deficit for the municipality by using public funding. So that was a specific project. Off the top of my head, I don't immediately remember the organization, unfortunately, but I can definitely go back and I can email you and mention that, and I can give you the case study for sure because it's published on our website. So it was, yeah, it was a concern that it was a concern over the deficit. And they were looking for, like they were concerned about like, oh, would there be benefits that would outweigh this, because we would be increasing this deficit. And then the project team came back to them and they were talking about like all these different, like, yes, the deficit would increase, but like the long-term benefits would actually outweigh everything and would balance things out in the end. Excuse me. So it was related specifically to the deficit at the time. I hope that answered. Okay, perfect. Thank you. um, and Joni says, find at least one pessimist. Yeah, for your committee. It's always good to have a bunch of different voices, on these committees, right? Because you need these different opinions and views, and in a way, that's also the benefit of having different roles on a building committee, right? Because you need to have differing opinions, and as I even said in the brainstorming section, the brainstorming workshop section of this webinar, the process needs to be a little bit messy, quote unquote, to be successful. So it would seem a bit odd for it to go, too smoothly. Thank you very much for your questions. I appreciate that. I will just head back a little bit. Right. So if there are any more questions, you can feel free to send me an email. Again, I'll throw up my email at the end of the webinar, so you'll have it. And if you have other questions, even towards the end of the webinar, I can also email you back afterwards. So we will now move on to our conclusion. So before we close off for the day, I would like to share some information on our Creative Space Case Study webinar series and our Learn It, Build It, Manage It workshops as part of this learning series. Please be aware that programs and webinars and workshops will likely be postponed due to COVID-19 measures and preventative measures against it. So please keep that in mind, but we will of course update you on all of these dates as we develop them. And then as well, I'd also like to take some time towards the end of the webinar to talk about funding opportunities, as well as programs, tools, and resources that would be available to you and could be of interest to you. I see that we do have one question, so from Dua, and what I will do is I will just email you at the end of the webinar to see if I can answer your question, just because we're in the conclusion sort of period. So to support the Creative Space case study series, ArtsBuild Ontario also has a webinar series that highlights various creative space capital projects. Each webinar is led by arts leaders who were involved in many or all aspects of their respective capital project. Free recordings of all of the webinars we have done thus far as part of this series are available at the links shown, and they can be viewed at your leisure. These recordings are also available on our website, so be sure to check them out. One webinar we have coming up as part of this series is on the Al Green Theater, titled Improving Venue Accessibility. In this webinar, Angie Stilitano and Peter Falaber of the Miles Nadal Jewish Community Center will speak on the project to make improvements to the seating, doors, and more with accessibility in mind for the Al Green Theater. This theater is a lively, multi-use cultural arts and performance space dedicated to supporting arts and culture in the heart of Toronto. Updates on the date for this webinar will be posted on our website, as I mentioned. Whoop, I jumped a little bit ahead. There we go. Another of our upcoming webinars will be led by Hugh Nielsen, Managing Director of the Great Canadian Theatre Company. This theatre company is Ottawa's largest professional independent theatre. After previously operating out of a renovated truck garage on Gladstone Avenue, the Great Canadian Theatre Company moved to the Wellington West neighbourhood of Ottawa, where the theatre now calls the Irving Greenberg Theatre Centre its home. Hugh will share stories of how the organization achieved its dream of the new facility, how it successfully tackled debt, as well as thoughts and approaches on how to reduce the possibility of similar circumstances. If you are interested in the process of relocating your creative space, learn firsthand from Hugh as he discusses this capital project. The date for this webinar will be announced on our website as well, so please keep an eye out for that. If you are interested in learning about alternative financing methods and strategies to engage your community for your creative space capital project, join us for our final Learn It, Build It, Manage It Part 1 workshop in Cambridge. Julia Vlad and Jeremy Freiberger will discuss these topics in detail, providing you with the tools that you will need to be successful with your capital project. This workshop currently has a new date, which is Tuesday, May 12th at the Cambridge Centre for the Arts. Please note that this date is subject to change as a preventative measure against COVID-19, so we will be monitoring this situation very closely, and we will keep you all updated. We would also like to announce that our Part 2 Learn It, Build It, Manage It workshops will be announced very soon. While Part 1 focuses on alternative financing and engaging community, Part 2 will open a discussion on building and maintaining your creative spaces. Whether a new build or a small to medium-sized renovation, navigating the construction of a creative space is a complex and non-linear process. Randy Dalton from the Dalton Company will use local examples to offer strategies for creative space managers to successfully execute building projects on budget and on time. Additionally, after the completion of a building project, managing a space proactively and sustainably should be an ongoing consideration for arts leaders. Using pertinent examples from the sector, Bryn Jones from Walter Fady will present practical and efficient methods that arts leaders are using to manage their spaces and assets. To give you a more detailed outline of our currently planned workshops, the current dates for these and locations of these are shown on the slide right now. So for the first two workshops we have, the first is in Kitchener on Tuesday, May 26th, followed by Guelph on Tuesday, June 9th. We also have a workshop happening for this Part 2 in Orangeville for Tuesday, September 22nd, and in Waterloo on Tuesday, October 20th. And of course, we will have our final Part 2 workshop on Tuesday, November 10th. Again, these dates are, of course, subject to change just due to these preventative measures that we need to take. but we will keep everyone updated on, if dates change, if if there's new dates to be made, we will keep everyone informed on our website. And I will also be providing a link to our Learn It, Build It, Manage It webpage in the email following this webinar. And so we will be providing that link to you in that email, and you'll be able to access it. Moving on to some of ArtsBuild Ontario's core programs and resources, the Asset Planner for the Arts is a cloud-based asset management program that tracks the condition of your facility assets, as well as the replacement costs for building components. Asset Planner for the Arts is a tool that not only provides you with a more detailed outlook on your project in the moment, but it offers detailed capital forecasts for the future of your project for the next 30 years, with a focus on the next 5 years. For more information on this core program, please contact our Executive Director, Alex Glass. The Accessibility Toolkit for Creative Spaces in Ontario is designed to provide resources on accessibility legislation in Ontario, including the AODA and Design of Public Spaces Standards, Ontario Building Code, and Human Rights Code to arts organizations across Ontario. While it features resources for best practices in creative spaces, it also focuses on experiential accessibility, including how arts organizations are going beyond the standard to offer inclusive space. You can access our Accessibility Toolkit on our website at the link shown. Plan It, Build It is a tool that supports arts organizations executing capital projects. It is a guideline designed to equip arts organizations to plan and execute capital projects with a step-by-step approach. Plan It, Build It is coordinated with ArtsBuild's resource library to offer access to industry standard guidelines and best practices. You can read more about Plan It, Build It on the link shown at the bottom of the slide as well. As I mentioned a little bit earlier in this webinar, there are additionally 2 funding sources for capital projects and creative space projects that we'd like to highlight. These are the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund and grants under the Ontario Trillium Foundation. The Canada Cultural Spaces Fund is a federal fund that supports the improvement of physical conditions for arts, heritage, culture, and creative innovation. It is a matching fund that will cover up to 50% of your project costs, so please keep this in mind when considering to apply. With this fund, your project is contingent on the funder timeline as well. The fund supports renovation and construction projects, the acquisition of specialized equipment, and feasibility studies related to cultural spaces. Those eligible to apply include professional, not-for-profit arts and heritage organizations incorporated under the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, Part 2 of the Canada Corporations Act, or under corresponding provincial or territorial legislation. Provincial or territorial governments, municipal or regional governments, and their agencies are also eligible, as well as Aboriginal peoples' institutions or organizations. In addition, you can apply anytime for this program, as the application process itself is ongoing. Prior to submitting your application, we recommend that you contact a CCSF program officer at your nearest regional office of the Department of Canadian Heritage. There are also capital grants under the Ontario Trillium Foundation to consider as well. These are provincial grants that broaden access and improve community spaces. Activities that are funded in these grants include buying and installing equipment, doing renovations, installations and repairs, building structures or spaces, making better use of technological resources, and more. Funding amounts range anywhere from $5,000 to $150,000 for a term of up to 1 year. The current application deadline for capital grants under OTF is Wednesday, November 18th, 2020. So be sure to keep that date in mind if you are considering to apply. Lastly, in addition to the funding sources mentioned, ArtsBuild Ontario also has a number of funding resources, alternative financing methods, and fundraising tools listed on our website that may be applicable to your creative space project. So please be sure to check out our Finding Funds page on our website, the link to which is on the slide shown. We would also like to encourage you to please take our evaluation survey for this webinar, as your feedback is extremely valuable to us. It should only take about 5 minutes of your time. We will be sending out a link to the survey following this session, so please keep an eye out in your email inboxes for that. Lastly, ArtsBuild Ontario would like to acknowledge our funder, the Department of Canadian Heritage, for supporting the Creative Spaces Case Study Series project. And with that, thank you very much again to everyone who attended this session, and for those who asked such great questions, made such great comments. It was lovely to take the time to answer questions and speak with you and just kind of engage. You can check more upcoming webinars on our website at artsbuildontario.ca. And if you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. Again, my name is Amy Poole, and you can contact me via email at amy@artsbuildontario.ca. So you'll have the link on this slide there as well. Thank you very much for joining us.